Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the second day of the Digital Capitalism Congress here at Friedrich Ebert Foundation. My name is Geraldine de Bastian, and I have the pleasure of leading you through this evening's program, this interview session, which is going to focus on AI and medicine. Before we begin, I'd want to point out that the session is taking place in English, but we do have different translation services available for you, and you can check those out via our website. So, there are great expectations when it comes to the use of AI in medicine, such as detecting illnesses earlier or providing individualized and custom-made treatments, for instance. However, digitization of health services is also seen as one of the most lucrative markets of the future, now possibly more than ever during the COVID pandemic. So how can we ensure that digitization and the deployment of AI do not primarily serve boosting individual companies' profit margins, but really serve patients' well-being? I am very much looking forward to discussing this topic together with Bart de Witte. He is one of the leading experts of digital transformation in healthcare today. In his former life, Bart worked at IBM, most recently as Director of Digital Health Services and SAP, but today he is working toward open and equal access to AI in medicine. He founded the HIPPO AI Foundation, which he's going to tell us more about in a minute, and the Digital Health Academy here in Berlin, and is also part of the founding faculty of the European Institute of Exponential Technologies and Desirable Futures, Future.io. Welcome, Bart. It's great to have you here today.
It's great to be here.
So I would like to start with one of these general fears that we sort of like to keep as a pet topic here in Germany, which is the fear about automation and AI. AI being one of the factors that could possibly take away some of our jobs. And I would like to dive into this topic, talking about pathologists and pigeons, because I watched a talk of yours that you gave about, I think, 2 years ago, where you describe what might be one of the first jobs in medicine to go, as being people who look at a lot of images or other data trying to find the right diagnosis, and those are pathologists. Maybe you can elaborate on the question why being automated is not always the worst fate that we could experience based on that example.
Yeah, that example is a very provocative example because I was always confronted with the fear, especially from the medical domain, that AI would automate their jobs. And if you read media, there was always catharsis, the drama, we will lose everything. And I found a research paper, where they trained pigeons to look at cancerogenous cells on pathology images. And after a week of training, these pigeons got better than humans. And I made this joke that I didn't see in any media reports that pigeons would take over our jobs. But even if pigeons can do this better as humans, there is still this, we would not completely transfer that to that technology or animal technology. So I think when you look at a lot of the diagnostics in healthcare, it is based on pattern recognition. And the reason why these pigeons got better than humans is because pigeons have a much more wider array of light waves they can see. So they can see much better than humans. And if they look at images, they see much more different patterns than we humans can do. That's why they got better. But now, if you think about technology, sensors and cameras and processing power has nearly endless capacity. So it is without doubt that these machines will recognize patterns way better than humans do, which doesn't mean that in the future there is no job for pathologists, because now we are entering the stage of genetics, and where pathologists are using genetic data to do diagnostics. So it's a transformation to new layers of information that doctors need to take decisions on.
So I'm sure that you get to talk and to think about these topics a lot, but for those people watching us who maybe have not got a full overview, diagnostics is one area. Can you give us a little bit of a general overview? Where does AI today and where will it in future impact the health sector? What are the main use cases?
Yeah, the future is important because we are at the very early stage of AI, and we are building AI on a foundation that will be the same as the future AIs that will do more complex things. So that's why perhaps we overestimate the AI today or the capacities today, but I think we shouldn't overestimate it or underestimate it, because the foundation that we choose today will be the foundation of an perhaps general AI that will be able to cure all diseases. Today we are very good at recognizing patterns in images like radiology or pathology. I was part of an experience in Africa where we started using images made by a mobile phone, and we were taking photographs of the cervix for detecting cervical cancer. And after 5 years, that startup that created that service was better than the pathology and the lab. So the pap smear, the standard test, the golden standard that we use. So image recognition is something where AI is really good. Where it gets difficult is when we start using written data, textual data, because it always has a context. It's super biased because data is produced in a specific context. In the US, we see that a lot of the data is optimized for billing purposes because that was what data served for. But in the future, we will be able to combine medical imaging with textual data, with genetic data, and we call this multi-omics, multimodal analytics. But I think the biggest promise is going to be in biology, which is applied medicine, or applied biology is medicine, where we start to analyze how diseases start and how we can stop diseases from happening. And that's going to happen when we start analyzing biological data, which is multi-omics. Like there are different ways of looking at genetics, and there are different layers. And if we analyze that, we will be able to early detect diseases, and we will be able to find therapeutics or lifestyle changes that will prevent diseases from happening.
So that's a little bit of an outlook, but we're preparing that future right now. We need data to feed those AIs, and we're basically in the sort of stepping stones toward that future. Where is that process taking place right now? So maybe especially in Germany, but also in Europe, where are we at today when it comes to using data already now for healthcare or gathering that data that's needed to power those future AIs?
Yeah, that's where everybody is aiming for, to get early access to data, not because they want to use the personal information in healthcare. I think the value that you get out of the collective, the aggregated data, is much more important than the personal data. So taking the fears away that people are collecting data to use it for personal advertisements, as in commerce, is not as interesting, because it's much more interesting to find new patterns within that data to detect diseases. So there are different ways to do that. There are startups that create a service, and the lower the barriers are to give data to that specific designed app, the more data we'll start sharing. The more value we get back in a free modus, the more data we will start sharing. We know these principles from very different digitized industries. And there are other ways to do that. Like there is a way to buy data or even acquire the whole company. Like startups getting acquired by larger companies like in pharma or in big tech. There is a large search engine company in the US. I think everybody knows who that large search engine is, but they bought Fitbit. And within that Fitbit organization, there is data from 80 million people with lifestyles, collected lifestyle data, where you walk, where you sleep, what your heart rate is. So people are starting to buy data. So there is, even though a lot of people tell that there is no monetary value on data, there is a huge battle now to get access to data, and it's based on who has the largest capital to buy these companies, or who is accelerating the investments within a startup as fast as possible to build these tools that collect data.
Okay, so let's dig a little bit deeper there. Those different stakeholder groups that you started introducing. I got to talk to Shoshana Zuboff yesterday, of course, also about the role that big tech corporates are playing in today's society. And you just mentioned Alphabet, Google acquiring Fitbit, which was, of course, nothing to be surprised about, really. No. Just like Google acquiring Nest was nothing to be surprised about, but something that caused a lot of media attention nonetheless. Maybe you can outline the role that the big tech corporates are playing in the field of data and healthcare presently, or would like to play also in future.
Yeah, I think what these companies, it's not only big tech, it's like internet tech and data-driven companies, because I think there are tech companies that don't have a data monetization model, so we need to differentiate between big and data monetization. So the companies that are really good in handling data are coming from or social media or e-commerce, like Amazon is e-commerce, or social media would be Facebook, or internet search, which is Google. And what they can do really well is understand or collect data and create out of the data actionable information. And what we have been seeing is that these companies are starting to get hungry to acquire more data because they want to enter this field of healthcare. And what actually happens with, you have to go a bit back why they got so dominant, because they perfectly understand when you are the first one to deliver a service that is better as everybody else services, nobody will use second best. So that's why Google Search has 92% market share in Europe. Ask Microsoft how many billions they invested to create a competitor. They were not able to create a competitor because they were lacking the user interaction. And every interaction generates data. So every query that we do on a search generates data that is used, again, for optimizing the search results. So bring this now to healthcare. The first one who is then delivering the services that delivers the best results will probably collect more data, and through that new acquisition of data, you will go most probably to the same kind of centralization, monopolized models as we have seen in other industries, which is my biggest fear in that sense.
Maybe we can elaborate on that a little bit, because we touched in different sessions yesterday a little bit also on the topics of like unwanted data usage in future, and sometimes not even knowing the ride that we got in for with these big tech companies. So what maybe is the sort of, looking at the dark side of things, what could be a negative route that could go down, or what could be some of the consequences and effects? I'm thinking of, what could be alliances also between tech corporations, internet companies, and healthcare providers in future. The idea that, for instance, Facebook can detect something like Parkinson's disease before you would know yourself by the rhythm of how you're typing into their chat message and such phenomena.
Yeah, I don't fear that they will use that information in that sense, that they will sell it to insurance companies or life science companies. I think they are quite conscious about it. I fear that you don't control what can be detected. And there was this huge scandal where Facebook used data to do exactly a research on depression, but the participants didn't give their consent to be part of that research. So I think when you use these platforms, you don't use them because you want to get diagnosed on specific health issues. Like if somebody would listen to us and he would use a specific algorithm and analyze our voice, he could get a clear picture on how much you are close to getting a depression, how much you are close to getting a schizophrenic. So even the voice became a very good indicator where we can have digital biomarkers that indicate how mentally healthy you are. So that means that we can't protect it anymore, because otherwise we should not speak here online on events, because my voice became suddenly a model that transfers information that is related to my health.
It very quickly brings us into very ethical questions around the topic of how early do you want to know? Like, how much agency will the human have to say, thanks, I might not want to know that diagnosis until whatever time I'm ready for, the sort of general agency that we have to be in charge, basically, of our health and our bodies before letting other systems around us decide what is best for us.
I think it's a double sword in that sense, because at one side we want to move in prevention, and prevention means to know your risks of specific diseases. So that means if I know that through lifestyle changes I won't get diabetes, then perhaps I will change my lifestyle. Diabetes is a perfect example that through lifestyle changes like nutrition, movement, that you can really calculate well how low or high your risk is, or how you can influence your risk. So it's a double-edged sword. Like, you want to know the potential risks. The problem is if as you said, like agency, if organizations that don't have or don't have that role or don't have that mandate that you give them to analyze that information and use it subsequently for others. Like, I give an example, there are in the US startups that using that voice analytic algorithm that I just explained for doing job interviews. And they analyze candidates on their voice and their mental health. They just don't call it a diagnosis. They just give some numbers on this is the ideal candidate.
I find that super scary, I have to say. And I guess it's a little bit, it comes back down to the agency of the individual in a way, because if you're talking about prevention to enable me to live the fullest life that I can and I want to live, that's a great thing. But if we're talking about prevention in a way that we can heighten efficiency to perform better in this capitalist performance society that we live in, or to have third parties like a future employer or an insurance company, which you mentioned earlier, know about the client or the employer they're engaging with, then I find it a little bit worrying if that's another sort of amplification of that way that society is growing anyway.
Yeah, I said a few years ago we need to definitely dig deeper into the anti-discrimination laws, because I think instead of protecting data, we should start thinking on the other side of abuse of that information. And if you look at people who are have a specific disability, like if you are very visible disabled, you are protected by a lot of laws. But we are becoming as disabled because nobody is perfect. So through that information, everybody has a specific ability and disability in something. And that means that everybody can get discriminated on based on that information. So I think we need a much more larger discussion on the risk stratification within insurance companies that are being used, if that is still applicable in a world where everything gets more precise and predictable.
So we've talked a little bit about the role of the private sector and the big tech corporations in this. We tend to have a lot of skepticism when it comes to these topics, as I said in the opening question already, in Germany. And I would like to get to the role of the public sector in this whole thing. Now, I got to watch, so on the one hand we have a lot of skepticism, on the other hand we don't seem to have very adventurous tech skills. I got to watch a talk at the Chaos Communication Congress, I think 2 years ago, where I really recommend everybody seeing this talk, just taking apart all the different e-patient solutions that we have in Germany and hacking his way into every single system and showing how incredibly insecure all of these are, basically. So I felt this was very much sort of exemplary of the state of digitization in Germany, which seems to be, put mildly, not at the height of the global game somehow.
No, well, I think if you look in other regions, then security is as well a topic, but Germans are very particular on the topic of security and data protection. I think it's just the wrong focus. I think we need to, I'm part of that Future IO, which is about creating desirable futures. And if you want to live in a future that is desirable, you need to shape it. So having a discussion that blocks innovation and that doesn't drive innovation mostly pushes us into a future that others have designed. And that's what happened today. Like, we were very skeptical in a lot of senses, and we are using tools and platforms that are designed based on different value sets coming from different regions that are not compatible with our values in Europe. So I think that these always pushing and finding loopholes in the app, that is part of an optimization process. And we need to get over this. We need to, okay, there is an error, repair it, get further. And this needs to become a more, not a polarized discussion, but it should be more like, okay, let's help each other to create these safe environments. The thing what worries me more is that we are starting, because you mentioned public healthcare systems, that most of the digitalization is happening within the private sector. And we live in Germany, where we now just have the Digital Act, which is a Digital Health Act, which is an act where doctors can prescribe apps, which is great because these doctors can deliver value. But I question a lot of these things because who gave the government the mandate to suddenly privatize our public healthcare system? Because these apps are taking over quite a lot of the relationships. They are taking over therapies, and this is a privatization in healthcare.
So yesterday with Shoshana, we were speaking about the state surveillance model from China and the surveillance capitalism model from the US, and these big models we're facing. And she was making a plea that we need maybe not a European model, but a democratic alternative. And if I understand you correctly, that would also be a plea to create public sector alternatives to the business models that those companies who our data is being passed on to are following today.
I think it's not a one or the other. I think it's we can talk about, do we create an infrastructure which is a public infrastructure or a common infrastructure that is based on specific principles and values and especially on our human rights. Like if you talk about geopolitics, I think that's what politicians do. But if we talk about geopolitics, then we need to see who delivers the right to get access to healthcare. That is Europe. Europe has that within their fundamental rights in Article 35. There is written that everybody has the right to get access to healthcare, just like we have the right to get access to have privacy. So I think everything what we do in a specific sense should be based on our values. And then I think knowledge, that's where I'm very strong at. Knowledge in medicine, life-saving knowledge should be free, and the information should flow without any financial barriers in that sense. And I think that's where we can work on a public infrastructure. And then I have nothing against people creating better experiences and then earning money with these apps, but at least we don't have a competition or an industry that is giving some people access to life-saving knowledge and others not, because that's creating information asymmetries, and information asymmetries will always lead to inequalities.
I want to get deeper into that in a sec, but just very quickly in between, the initiative of our German current health minister in collecting health data, how would you place that within that context?
Well, he accelerated. So I've a kind of a two-folded opinion about his activities. So at least he accelerated the adoption of digital systems within the healthcare sector. In Germany was standing still, where there was a status quo since 15 years. So I give him all the credits for really accelerating that and bringing Germany on speed to start using digital tools to create better systems of care. And I think we all could profit from that during the COVID crisis, where people could get access through a teleconsultation with a doctor. They could get their e-prescriptions. They can one can send their medications at home. So the services got more convenient. And I think we all profited from that. So that's one part. It's like, hooray, that's a good evolution. The problem that I have is that at the same time, the public infrastructure, if you compare Germany with the IT budgets of hospitals with, for example, Holland, then a German hospital has an IT budget of 1.5%, where Holland has 8 to 10% in the public sector. So what we see here is that there is one sector being pushed by a Digital Health Act, but on the other side, the public sector is being not de-invested. There's now an act coming up, but there is a clear choice from him to go into a privatization and accelerating the adoptions of private tools. And he's very loud and vocal about this, that the next Google Health should come out of Germany. And I have to laugh a bit about this because I don't think it's a realistic view. It's
a very helpful statistic to put things into context there. Thank you.
Yes.
So I want to admit to our audience that I asked Shoshana a question yesterday with a healthcare-related or medical-related topic, and you ghost wrote that question because we had a chat about it earlier. Yeah. And I want to kind of pass it back to you because you brought up the example of the human genome and the political decision behind open sourcing that and not having that be a proprietary endeavor, but really a global endeavor, shared one to unlock the code of this human genome and then build on that in a public good sentiment. That was a decision made in 2000, as you pointed out, by Tony Blair and Bill Clinton. And I'm wondering that if you think this is how we should be treating technology or digitization in healthcare in general from your perspective.
Yeah, and thank you for bringing it up because that's after I left my job in corporate life, I started to analyze quite a lot of the influence on the transformation. And one of the parameters that I found is that the ability to privatize knowledge, which the human genome is knowledge about nature. If you have the ability to privatize that, you will always create an asymmetry of I own something and you don't. So you create what we call then scarcity, and you will put an economical value on that scarcity, and you will calculate that percent of the population will get access to that or not. I never thought I would advocate Tony Blair's and Bill Clinton in their decision making, but in that way, what they did there, I found it very courageous because what they did through their decision, quite a lot of biotechs who were investing in the privatization of that human genome lost instant value on the stock exchange, and he destroyed billions of value by making that decision. But now, looking back 20 years later, the price of sequencing a human genome is now as low as $1,000 a sequence. And that is because we democratized access, because companies could access to that. So opening up that common layer of genome data created access and created a healthy competition between the industry players that lower down the prices.
So how can we think about that analogy in terms of open sourcing AI in medicine?
Well, that's the thing what I've been looking in, like how do you create a similar effect with AI? And the problem with AI is that it has two layers. There is the data that you need to train an algorithm, and then you have the algorithm that uses specific methods. And then perhaps there is a third invisible layer because every time you use the algorithm, you get new data. So it's not something static as software code. So with software code, we all know open source or open source hardware designs, that these are quite static processes. So the way how to do this is to really rethink how we look at data. For me, data is part of a reflection of human life. And if you think about healthcare, data is nothing else as a replication of patterns of what actually exists in the physical world. And our fundamental rights forbid us to sell our organs. Our fundamental rights forbid us to create physical clones. But our fundamental minds don't forbid us to create digital clones. And these digital clones can be owned by private organizations. And I think we need to adopt this, because if this happens, I can build a digital avatar that speaks like me, acts like me, but I don't have any agency on it. It can open a bank account online for me using my voice, synthesized, and there is no way how you can control this. So I think we need to create a more ownership in terms of there is no clear mandate on who owns data. Everybody thinks that you own it, but it's not. There is, from an ethical point, from a legal point, there are very confusing definitions. And I think what I start doing is, no, we should say, like, we own our data and we can decide what we do with it. And I think the solution is to say, like, if I donate my data to an organization, I want it to demonetize. And so that means that you create common goods.
A quick question just on what needs to be open. Is it just the data, or is it also the AI, the technology, the code operating with that data itself? Like that?
Lots of the AI is already open. Like a lot of the algorithms are open. Google open TensorFlow. Like there's a lot of things that you can use. So if you look at the tools that we use to train AI, that got completely democratized, so which is why you see exponential growth in the publications of AI. So you see suddenly everybody getting access to the technology. So that is open. The problem is, and we have to define what open data is, because it's not about personal data. Open data is about anonymized data that can be used for training an algorithm, just like the pigeons looked at pathology data. It's purely anonymized. It's for training the AI system. And that needs to be open, but not open in terms of with a license that can create private knowledge, but open with a license that creates open knowledge. And there's a huge difference between those two.
Absolutely. So yesterday, there was a big... I love the moment where Shoshana was like, build it and they will come. The idea that we need to start building alternatives and platforms. And I know you felt spoken to, but I also felt like, oh, that's so cool. I have Bart with me tomorrow. And he is building alternatives. So I said in the introduction that you have a foundation called HIPPO AI. Can you share with us what you're doing there and what your vision is for building these open source alternatives?
Yeah, so it's probably the most craziest thing I ever did, and a lot of people say, like, what are you doing? So I first analyzed more than a year to how can you open source medical AI. So there was a lot of learnings, a lot of conversations, a lot of trials. And then I realized, okay, it has to be a non-profit. So it's in German a gemeinnützige GmbH that we founded. And the goal of that non-profit is to collect donations, financial donations, because as soon as we start collecting industrial memberships or whatever, we're going to be influenced by the industry. Or as soon as you receive money from public money, in a sense, you will be influenced. Because one of the conversations I had was with the founders of Medicine Without Borders. And they told me that they didn't refuse from day one money from any government because they're going to war zones and they want to avoid when there is a boycott against the country that suddenly they can't act there. And it's like, okay, if you think about democratized AI, it should be free of political influence. It should be free of religious influence, which in some countries is a huge thing when you talk about female health. So the only way how to do this is creating an NGO, a non-profit, that is of the people, by the people, and for the people. And that's what we are doing. So we are collecting data. We are in a very early stage. It is a really difficult trajectory, but we are advancing. So what we are doing is we're setting up campaigns now. Like this is from a campaign about breast cancer. So we are... this is about ESCI code that reflects my body and that tells you that your body is data and human life is data. So what we are asking is people to donate their data. We can't collect data, by the way, but we collect the data from research projects, from individuals we can't yet. But the goal is to collect data, to create data pools, and then protect that data with an open knowledge license. That means everything what happens with that data pool will be free of economic interest. So people can start using that data, creating AI methods and using algorithms, but everything what touches our data is creating an ecosystem of openness. And everybody who uses these algorithms is obliged and mandated to share. So what we are creating is a bit of a medical internet with open knowledge in that sense.
Just a quick geeky question. What kind of licenses exactly are you using? Or did you have to come up with those yourself? Or is
we created an own license. Okay. We don't know if that is going to hold. Like it's the HIPPO AI license, which is specifically on AI. There are other open knowledge licenses out there, but they had loopholes because somebody asked me, okay, if you're going to create open data and a big tech would use that data, how do you avoid them from using that data in an ensemble model, which is a more complex thing, but how can you avoid them from doing that? So what we described in the license model is that if a big tech would use our data, they need to open up their private knowledge and open up their own algorithms, which is mostly their USP. So they can't touch that data. And if they do, then they will need to pay fines over time.
In order for this to be effective, don't you need to be like ahead of everybody's game when it comes to the data sets you're collecting and building, or where's going to be the turning point for this to have an impact?
The target point will be that we're creating global data that is inclusive and that has no bias. And there is some voices here that in Germany we need to create from the government German data pools. And it's like, what are you going to do then if there is a person from Africa coming to the Charité and you're going to say like our AI is only trained on European and German data, so we can't treat you? That data needs to be global. So we need the biodiversity that is reflecting in the data. So what we are doing with HIPPO AI is we're building up a global network of HIPPO AI ambassadors, and each of these ambassadors is creating HIPPO zoos, which are local communities that will then start working together with local hospitals that we can then use to collect data that we then globally bring together.
I've read a pretty scary, in my mind at least, example of how such kind of data exchanges can work, of a Chinese startup called CloudWalk AI that basically acquired the whatever set they had of Zimbabwean people's faces from the Zimbabwean government, because the AI was only used to Chinese faces and they wanted to train it with African faces, albeit in a country that has pretty much zero data protection laws and wants to use this Chinese technology for public security, which probably basically means citizen surveillance. So I'm guessing you're taking a very different path with these communities that you're building up. But I'm still wondering, like, where's the leverage point? Like, how do you make sure you're, let's say, getting to the right data sets and the quantity of data sets you need whilst there's those kind of public-private partnerships happening at the same time?
Yeah, that's a very good question, because there is no standardized case in that sense. It depends, first of all, what kind of data. So if you're touching genomic data, anonymization is really hard, so that's going to be very different. So it's not going to be that accessible. You need to locally host it and make it accessible to others, but the data stays within the hosted center. So it depends, first of all, on the use case. Secondly, we as an organization, we don't want to hire and train a lot of people with clinical skills. We work with third-party contracts with renowned clinical institutes that have the expertise. So we are building a network of clinical partners that will do that for us, and we use the funds that we receive, the donations that we receive, to fund these projects. That's at least the goal.
I personally really appreciate the global perspective that you have on this topic, and especially also on the topic of data sovereignty that you just touched on, because I sometimes do fear that when looking at these new models of data management, like data trust and data stewardship, that we may be steering into a very regionalized or even nationalized protective era of the internet. And often when these discussions center around, we have to have the local community benefit first from the data, or citizen of a certain country benefit first from that data, I wonder about other communities and other areas of the world that also need data to grow their societies in a democratic and economically prosperous way, sort of leaving out the responsibility perhaps of also seeing the global connectedness. And I feel that you're doing that with your work. There are
big tech companies going to low-income countries, and I was at the AI for Good conference in Geneva, watching that these big tech companies were advocating about bringing the AI service to the most vulnerable populations of this planet.
Google's new AI center in Accra, Ghana, or IBM's in Lagos and Kenya.
So it's about the service. So they were treating patients with detecting if they have diabetic retinopathy, which is a risk on blindness when you have diabetes. But these patients don't have any other possibility to share their data to get medical access. And what happens there is that the data is extracted out of these regions as a valuable asset, and then the economical value creation is being done in Silicon Valley. And this is what Nick Couldry, which is a scholar for London School of Economics, calls data colonialism, which is a word I picked up on. And I said, what we do is we collect data out of Western countries and we make it available for Indians as well. So I call it sometimes reverse colonization, because we are making data equally available. So equality and equity is extremely important in our network, because everything what we do is available for everyone, even though that the amounts of data that we have available is much more, because our systems are more digitized. As for example, in a country like Niger, where there were 5 years ago, there were 6 registered pathologists on a population of 18.8 million inhabitants.
A lot more pigeons, probably.
Yes. Well, yeah, I don't know if there are pigeons over there. Perhaps there are other animals that can
there are pigeons
They're using dogs for smelling at urine to detect prostate cancer. So they're using dogs for detecting COVID patients at the airport in Finland. So these are the kind of same examples.
So is that something that you would like to be understood in general, or something that you see particularly relative to your initiative when we're talking about data stewardship and data trust services? Do you think the priority needs to be on the common good rather than the localization or the regionality of data?
Well, we realized that this needs to be, as it's of the people, by the people, and for the people, completely 100% people-driven. So our first campaign is called Victoria 10. You can look at the website, victoria10.org. And Victoria is a breast cancer patient that came to me. And she said, like, I want to help. I have breast cancer, and I want to use my disease for contributing to the good. And then we were in discussion. It's like, do you want to lend your face and your voice to call all other patients to donate their data? So that's what we are doing. So every campaign that we will do is going to be 100% patient-driven. It has to be a people movement, because if you create a movement, as Shoshana said yesterday, then the policies perhaps will follow. So that's what we are doing. So we need everyone to share it. And as this is a super abstract topic, we need to educate. So what we are doing is on our social media channels, which is a bit of a contradiction because we have to use them to get access to the people, is starting to communicate. So we will create a set of lectures, very short ones, to educate people on the specific questions so they get more knowledgeable.
But if I understood you correctly, you said that individual data donations are not something that you're accepting yet. How is that? How do you expect that to work in future?
It will depend on what kind of data you collect. The problem with individual data is data, as I mentioned, has always context. So if you take data from 1,000 different patients that all come from different doctors in different contexts, that data is going to be really messy because every data in a set has had a different purpose. Like, as I mentioned, data in the US is extremely biased because if you change a bit of the diagnosis within the documentation system, you will get a higher DRG, like higher payment. So the payment was what served the data documentation. It was not the clinical decision making. Now, by using that data that had a different purpose, you create a false diagnosis because you're going to use that messy data. So what we are doing is, at the beginning, because the main goal that we have is to create a really fast impact, because we will live from donations, just like Doctors Without Borders or the Ocean Cleaner Project, which is my favorite NGO on this planet, is that we need quick impact. And how can we create quick impact is by contacting researchers that already have data out of their research projects, that where they have the consent of the patients for using that data, which is anonymized, and bringing data sets from Europe together with data sets from the US, data sets from South America, data sets from India on the same topic, and uniting these data sets already is creating the global data set that is not there yet. There is no global data set. There are data sets with German patients, there are data sets with US patients, but there are no global data sets.
This is where you see a USP, right? That you can win the race because that doesn't exist yet. But yeah.
We need to be creating the data sets. And I think that's how we can most probably, I don't call it, if it's a race, then it's competitive. The best thing that can happen is that when we create that movement, that people start to think that, hey, this is our data. The knowledge out of the data of the collective of humans belongs to society and not to the economy. So if we start thinking a bit different, instead of being the victim of these platforms, but being the actors of a different future that we can define ourselves, then I think we have a bigger change.
I feel like you're onto something, not just in general, but also I feel like, it's something we from a sort of activist perspective have been advocating for a long time and like trying to educate people about for a long time. But now facing this terrible pandemic, I think there's a new perhaps momentum there and a new kind of awareness. And maybe also a new possibility to mobilize. Is that also your hope and what you're tapping into at the moment?
Well, I was part of a project that in the 11th of March, a friend of mine who lives in Berkeley created a Facebook group to call everybody who was related to 3D printing.
I love how we're already laughing at Facebook group now. It sounds like a thing we're not doing anymore, but like, lack of alternatives. So.
That was the lack of alternative, and it's the fastest way to reach a large crowd. So within 8 weeks, that group had 80,000 people, and within 8 weeks, that group printed over 20 million of goods, all based on open source. Within 8 weeks, the FDA approved these designs, 3D printed designs for emergency use without certification. Within 8 weeks, in 42 countries, groups were suddenly exchanging designs, optimizing, and I've never seen something like this. Like, it's the best example of when you have a shared enemy and a shared purpose, which was COVID, then people collaborate. So I think the moment where the US and China and Europe will collaborate is when we have spaceships above our cities that are able to kind of destroy us. Then we're going to all unite and attack those aliens. So I think that's what we need. We need shared purpose. And that's what I give with the foundation.
That's a really good example, because we have seen a lot of fantastic examples of the use of open technologies in healthcare globally. There's an NGO called Field Ready that equipped basically the whole of Haiti with umbilical cord clasps after the terrible earthquake there, when there were no deliveries possible, and they just 3D printed them on site, and have another whole list of fantastic use cases like that. So as you said correctly, crisis brings ingenuity and maybe also a different space for innovation than what we've seen before. I want to get back to the sort of role of the individual in creating these data sets, because something that we also touched upon yesterday, very briefly in discussions, something that I think a lot of people would say from today's perspective is to be avoided, is to see your personal data as something that you can capitalize on, something you can monetize. This kind of idea that Jaron Lanier introduced, I think, back in 2013, which is now, by many scholars and activists, been criticized as being a very neoliberal perspective on the data. Do you fear this is opening or reopening the door maybe for that discussion in a way?
Well, I've been contacted by quite a lot of blockchain data marketplaces that kind of have the idea that we, for companies to use our data, should get monetized and rewarded. And then I said, like, okay, then even if you would get rewarded, the maximum you could get out of your health data for clinical use would be $1,500. Compare this to the $2.2 million cost for a new gene therapy, you will not come far with that. So I think the idea that you will get, first of all, things back is a wrong idea, because you are just adding up cost for these industries to get access to data. And if you are adding up cost to that data, you will accelerate, in that sense, big techs or bigger companies to be first, because they have access to larger capital pools to buy that data. So it will just accelerate monopolization if you're going to put a price on data, because then data equals capital, and then big capital equals big data in a sense. And if you have then the one who, and that's what we see happening through acquisitions, the ones who can do it is the fastest are the ones who are creating de-asymmetries or knowledge ownerships in that sense. And you see this in not only in big tech, you see that the same thing in pharmaceutical companies as well.
I wonder where you feel that you would like to have more allies, perhaps, in what you're doing. I totally understand the idea of really pioneering in the field and being the first to create such global data sets, as you explained. But where perhaps do you think that the state should be playing a different role? There should be other players within the ecosystem to make what you're doing with HIPPO AI more impactful?
It's a good question. Like of course, everybody who wants to donate should donate to us. But I think I'm very skeptical in getting access to money that is connected to governments, just for the reason because I worked 19 years in that industry, and I'm going to whistleblow a bit here, but there are quite a lot of German public academical hospitals now that are selling their data. There are public academical hospitals that have contracted specific pharmaceutical companies that give these pharmaceutical companies exclusive access to data that is generated at the patient bed, and they get money for that. So I'm thinking that by using the public system, you will solve that problem for data monetization is absolutely wrong, because what is happening in Germany is that there is a lot of capitalization. So hospitals are starting to sell out their data. And these are public hospitals. And I'm not going to name any names. But
obviously, I was going to ask you that next. But I mean, that sounds absolutely outrageous. What is the legal base for that? And how can more attention be brought to such? I mean, I'm very glad you're bringing attention to it now. But it seems like that's something that's to be very much avoided, especially in the situation we're all in now.
Well, the thing is, if I understand these hospitals in one point, if they don't have IT budgets, they will look for other ways to get budget to build these data infrastructures. And if then other companies tell that, oh, we are going to invest in your data infrastructure, but then we want access to that data, then this is what happens. So if you lack funding in the public infrastructure, they will start being creative. And during my time when I was working with IBM, most of the clients I went to, they said, like, we want to do an AI project. We don't have money, but we can give you data. And it's like, IBM is not a company that lives from monetizing data. It's not an internet company. So that's the bomb. Like, that's why I'm very skeptical. But I'm hoping that the European Union on that level gives me access to data pools, to funding pools that we can start using.
Well, okay, I hope there are going to be a lot of angry tweets going out to Mr. Spahn tonight or tomorrow morning.
It's not Mr. Spahn. It's like the local healthcare systems are run by local governments. So
it's always federal. And we had a discussion about digital education yesterday. So this is very much along the lines of the sadly downfalls of our otherwise very, I think, great federal system. Ladies and gentlemen, I failed to point out that you can, of course, participate in this conversation, which is my bad totally, but I hope you realize that there's a hashtag behind us, DigiCap, which you can use to communicate questions to us on Twitter. And now is the point where I'd like to open up the discussion, and I have a colleague who's going to help with this, a co-moderator who I'd like to introduce to you. It's Daniel Leisegang, who's editor at Die Blätter, which is a magazine that I hope you've all read, and if not, should be reading, and also a cooperation partner of the DigiCap Congress. So I would like to pass the stage microphone over to Daniel now and see if we have questions coming in from the audience.
Well, thank you both. Thank you, Geraldine, and thank you, Bart, for this very exciting debate on an alternative and I think very purposeful approach here, especially in regard to that we are facing right now a pandemic and also a new global trade, but also tech war between Asia or China and the United States and Europe in between. And there is one question regarding that came in on Twitter from Hendrik Mattis, and he, as I understood from his profile, is himself active in the field of digital health. And his question is there, like, he understands the risk that all the tech companies in Silicon Valley are for your approach, but also for the data, all our data in particular. So his question is, how can we foster, how can we support European companies to offer better services faster in order to keep health data and digital autonomy for health in the European Union?
And thank you for that question, Henrik. I think that's an easy answer. I think we need to be much bolder in terms of the standards that we define. And if we would say, like, we in Europe, because Article 35 says that we have to give everybody access to healthcare, means that medical knowledge should always be open. So imagine that in Europe, by standard, we would say, like, when we apply AI in the sector, the algorithms need to be published, even including the code, and everything has to be open. That sounds like the most craziest idea, most probably, but it's your economical value when you build a product is not based on I own the knowledge that others don't have. It's based on the user experience. It's based on so many other factors that we could create in Europe for the companies a shared layer, which I call the medical internet, a shared layer where companies can tap into, where they share, and where we don't have any competition on medical knowledge. Like Europe has 35,000 medtech companies, and 80% of these companies have less than 50 employees. Now, if you ask the CEOs, can you manage to transform them into AI companies, 75% of these companies say, I can't handle. So we have two options. Or these companies dock into an API of a big tech player, or we start collaborating on open source. And I think we should be bolder and going much more open source in this sector and defining it by using open standards.
Maybe I can extend that question a little bit, because I was wondering, and I find this question really interesting that Hendrik raised, but I was wondering, what is your experience in Brussels, in Berlin? Is there an awareness among politicians that the system has to change in advance, maybe? Because we're having this debate on Facebook, as we're having it here for a couple of years now. How do we split up Facebook? How do we set limits to the power of Facebook? This is one of the biggest questions in tech industry and politics in this relationship. So is there an awareness also? Maybe have they learned a lesson from the Facebook era?
Well, that's a very good question. There was a paper published 2 weeks ago where they analyzed all the papers that related to AI and ethics in the US. And 55% of these papers were financed by the big tech companies. So if you look at the European Union and you look at the Ethical Commission and you look at the influence of industry, I don't see the representation of smaller companies. I don't see the representation of individuals, but I see the representation of huge lobby influence. And I think to create something that would be a European agenda, I think we have to be also bolder and looking at who do we allow in such an organization or in such an Enquete-Kommission in Germany where it's full of industry interest and none is societal interest. So the other thing what was asked, how is my relationship to politicians in that sense? Well, I had quite a lot of meetings with politicians, and then they asked me, like, how can you earn money with open source? Like, they don't understand. Like, they don't understand that each health startup here in Berlin that gets millions of funding, 60% of the code within that startup app is based on open source. They would not even be able to develop anything if they would not be open source. So for God's sake, if they take decisions, get the experts on the table who are non-biased.
All right. Maybe another question which relates to what you said in the beginning about the pigeons that came in.
Thank you.
It's obviously something that you describe as a tool that we use, like a tool of better recognition of patterns. And this is the example of the pigeon, if I understood it correctly. So, but what do you think, and this is the question, how does the underlying system of knowledge is being changed through AI, especially in medicine?
Well, that's the underlying system of knowledge. But I think knowledge still needs to be published and peer-reviewed in that sense. But then to be able to peer-review it, it needs to be publicly accessible. And Nature magazine, for example, is pushing this agenda when companies report on AI performance in their research that the data and the code needs to be published together with the paper. Now, that's a good approach. Like, let's open it up. Let's make it transparent. And it all comes to that same question. Like, we have the infrastructure to create knowledge. AI is creating discoveries and making hypotheses. But I think the abstraction of knowledge should be always done by our academical institutes in that sense. And we have the infrastructure for that. But if these institutes start selling their data to fund their infrastructure, we are going completely the wrong way.
And maybe one last question. The approach that you describe, like the whole thing, the whole approach that you present is embedded in a capitalistic system, if I may say so, like in a market system. Like you describe the hospitals, and you describe on the one side, and on the other side there's the Silicon Valley. And then you seem to go for an alternative approach, a more grassroots approach. What makes you optimistic is the question that you will be able to create or to be part of a huge power shift that has to take place in order to avoid what you just described before?
Yeah, probably it's my senility, or I'm just crazy doing this. Like the decision that I took to do this is because I've been working 19 years in the industry, and I've heard quite a lot of discussions in 2000 around the European alternative to the search engine. And there were 100 millions of funding coming from the European Union to create an alternative. It was called Theseus and other names, and there were so many academics and scholars working on the alternative. But at the end, it was the business model and the platform that led to the monopolization. So we're all guilty to blame that we tried to create an alternative with the wrong infrastructure. So I think you need the industry. So yes, you need the capitalistic system. I don't think you need the neoliberalistic system, because if you want to think that the market will regulate, then you can go to Samuel Beckett that Shoshana mentioned yesterday. You can wait off Godot. Like you can wait. It's never going to happen. So I think you need to create a framework where companies can collaborate on. And so it's what I try to do is using my expertise and my experience working with the industry, trying to creating industry partnerships. I started a grassroots movement where the patient's advocate. And my hope was that if the Doctors Without Borders, they collect annually, I don't know if you're aware of this, how much do you think, Geraldine, that Doctors Without Borders get in donations annually in terms of euros?
Oh gosh, well, I mean, they do fantastic work, and I hope it's a lot, but
it is 1.6 billion a year, 1.6 billion a year, and it's like for 1.6 billion, I can create a lot of open data. So, and that's a bold statement, but I think if we are able to translate that's what we want to do, and if people, and I'm super happy to be here to be able to communicate, if people start spreading this idea that we as society are in control of our own future, and we can do this when we donate to a specific organization that creates open source for the industry, I think we have a solution.
1.6 billion is not a bad number. It seems to be a lot more than the German government is willing to invest in.
I can do it. It's not me. Like we are Gemeinnützige GmbH, we are regulated. Everything is going to be transparent. But even Ocean Cleaner Project from Boyan Slat, which is an NGO that wants to fish out the plastic of the ocean, they receive 150 million a year on donations. So it's about we can still direct as humans globally to donate in organizations that work for humanity.
I want to give you, first of all, thank you, Daniel. Thank you for being such a good advocate of the audience, and thank you to everybody who handed in questions to us today. I want to give you, before we close, Bart, the opportunity to shamelessly advertise, and if people want to get active and donate, where should they go after hearing your talk now? We
are still a bit in stealth mode, but we launched our first campaign, and that's called Victoria with a K, not with a C, victoria10.org. You can find all information there about the campaign, what we are doing, all the social media channels. We have not so much followers on social media, but we have created this amazing campaign where we try to visualize, because we learned that more people are influenced by images than by text. So we created a visual campaign where we translate the whole purpose and the whole vision that we have. And the more people that join us, share us, donate, and help to spread it, the faster I will be able to make an impact with my organization.
Absolutely, and I really want to see you do this and raise all these millions and change the game of open data and AI. Thank you so much for being with us here today, Bart. And yeah, ladies and gentlemen, I really hope you enjoyed this discussion as much as I did. If you want to share it with a friend, we're uploading all the videos of the talks happening here as soon as possible, basically the day after, on the website. And I want to leave you with a couple of recommendations because, of course, there's more coming up in the DigiCap program. The next interview that's going to be held here on our stage is going to be held by my colleague, Toby Müller. He is going to be speaking to Matthew Taylor, who's the director of the British Royal Society of the Arts, on November 18th. And they are going to be speaking about the labor market and yeah, basically all of our work lives changing in the time of Corona. And that conversation is also going to be translated into several languages. So I hope you're going to join us for that. And tomorrow, taking place in German, is a forum on the topic of home office and how to make your work life, how to arrange your work life during Corona times. That's happening at 2 p.m. tomorrow, and you can register for it via our website. I will be back here on the 18th as well, supporting Toby in his chat with Matthew Taylor, and I hope you all have a lovely evening.